Hello. If you or someone you know is suffering from the emotional instability due to the reading of a book syndrome, please call 1-800-MY-FEELS. Some common symptoms include
crying by yourself in a corner, wandering aimlessly, bursting into tears for no apparent reason, zoning out for extended periods of time, smashing your head off the wall, and feeling as if your life has lost all purpose. There's really no purpose to my life anymore. What is there for? There's nothing for me anymore. I don't know what to do with myself anymore.
Today we're going to take a look into the life of someone suffering from the emotional instability due to the reading of a book syndrome. Julian, why don't you introduce yourself?
My name is Julian, and I am suffering from the emotional instability due to the reading of a book syndrome.
Why don't you tell us a little bit about what you're feeling right now?
How I feel? I mean, I guess you could say things are really, really hard for me right now, and they have to go off and I have to get them. It didn't need to happen. It didn't need to happen.
Julian, darling, it's just a book. Those characters aren't real.
Not real? Not real? You're telling me they're not real? You don't understand.
If this reminds you of yourself or someone you know, please call 1-800-MY-FEELS to get the help that you need. Thank you. But seriously, guys, has anyone else been experiencing this type of ordeal? I mean, we become so emotionally invested in books and these characters. When things happen to them, it just it tears your heart in half. Is that just me? Am I crazy? I don't know. But I'm going to go through my top 8 books that have left me emotionally unstable that I can remember to this date. So the first book I read back when I was in grade 8, maybe? I think 8. We're going to go with 8. And that is The Timequake, which is the 3rd book in the Gideon trilogy by Linda Buckley Archer. And the one thing that put me so emotionally unstable after reading it was the very, very ending. And I'd gone through this entire series, and these are pretty big books that I was reading when I was in grade 8. So I read the first one, The Time Travelers, the second one, The Time Thief. I'm reading this one, the third one, The Timequake. Things are getting really, really intense. I'm like, okay, it's good. We got this. Okay, it's going good. Things are going to work out. It's going to work out. It's going to be fine. And then, the ending, what they ended up having to do in the ending made me so depressed because I felt like I was, so emotionally invested in these characters. And then I feel just everything that I just read about, everything that I had read about, and all, my time and emotions that had gone into this entire trilogy was just gone. Poof, done. It was it never happened, basically, is what ended up happening. And I was but I just, it hurt. It hurt. I was I had spent so much time with these characters. Why now? Why at the very, very end? Obviously, I understand why Linda Buckley Archer did what she did at the very end of the book, but it still made me depressed. The next book I have is The Amber Spyglass by Philip Pullman, which is the 3rd and final book in the Dark Materials trilogy, starting with The Golden Compass, The Subtle Knife, and then The Amber Spyglass. And the reason this one left me emotionally unstable is much, much, much like The Timequake. What had happened was I was so emotionally invested in these books, in these characters, in this world, because I read these probably back grade 6-ish. And I just remember being like, yeah, this is, oh my god, this is so good, and just getting to the end and being like, that did not just happen, but it just felt like everything that I had invested into these books was just for nothing, and that it was just all over and completely done. And obviously, again, I totally understand why Pullman did that. I totally understand, it makes complete sense, but it's still, like, it still hurts right here. You're like, but then oh, it's like I can't even, like, put it to words how devastating it was, because you feel like after all that time investing yourself in these characters, it was for nothing, when obviously it wasn't. But that's just how it feels when you, like, read the last bit and you're like, okay, I'm done. So the next book I have, and this might come to a surprise for quite a few of you for the fact that it's so low on my list, but that is The Fault in Our Stars by John Green. And I think a lot of you are probably like, what, are you kidding me? Like, that would be like my #1. That book made me cry and everything. Like, myself personally, I'm not a crier. I don't cry when I read books. I get obviously very emotional, but I never actually cry. Usually it kind of just ends up being that I'm like reading whatever, poof, close it, and then I'm like, and it just, like, it hurts afterwards. That's literally how I feel. That's my emotionally unstable state, as I've said. And so basically the only reason why this one is so low on my list is probably the fact that I was spoiled, because I had spent forever and a half before I actually decided to read it. Because basically I was like, no, I don't want to read it. I don't want to get myself invested in a depressing book right now. I can't handle that right now. So I kept putting it off and putting it off, and then finally I was like, hey, I need to read this before the movie comes out, because I need to read it before the movie, because that's like how I am with all books. I have to read it before the movie comes out. So basically, finally, it was just before I was about to read it, and I was just scrolling through Twitter, blah, 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 no big deal, and then I saw a picture that spoiled everything for me, and I was like, no, I don't want to read it now, but I just want to know how this ends up happening. So then I went through and I read it, and it, like, it broke my heart. Like, it made it on my emotionally unstable list. It just, because I knew it was coming, I kind of prepared myself a little bit more so I wasn't completely emotionally unstable, so that's why that one's there. The next book I have is Sisterhood Everlasting by Amber Spyglass, and this is the 5th and final book in the Sisterhood of the Traveling Pants books. And I read this, like, the first 4 Sisterhood of the Traveling Pants books when I was in, like, grade 8-ish, and then she came out with this, like, a year or 2 later, and I was like, oh my god, this is awesome, I totally want to read this. And so I got it, and I just remember reading it and being like the first few pages in, and I was like, oh, it hurts so much, and being like, you can't do that right then, oh my god, like, right in the beginning. But I loved figuring out where Amber Spyglass was going with this, and why everything happened, and it all kind of came together, and I loved it, and the story was beautiful. But I just remember, like, closing it and being like, oh, like, it was a happy but depressed oh, and I just didn't really know what to do with myself, so yeah. So the next book I don't actually have in physical copy, but it is The Last Guardian, which is the 8th and final book in the Artemis Fowl series by Eon Colfer. And the reason this book is so high on my list for me is because I loved this series. Like, for me, the Artemis Fowl books were like my Harry Potter. I didn't read Harry Potter until, like, a couple years back, but Artemis Fowl I've been reading for, like, years, so it was like my Harry Potter. And to read that last book and just what happens at the end, I remember feeling like, because I'd spent so many years reading these books and loving these books and being so invested, emotionally invested in these books, in these characters that I loved, and just what happens in the end, and seeing Artemis Fowl grow from, like, this immature, selfish, not even immature, he was just this selfish criminal mastermind in the first book, to this selfless, self-sacrificing guy in the last book. It's just for what happens in the end, it just breaks my heart, because I'd felt like everything I'd put into these books was just, like, gone. And I was like, but I love it. Don't do this to me. Don't do this to me. So yeah, that's why that one is really high on my list. The next book I have, which is going to come as a surprise to no one, I'm sure, and that is Allegiant by Veronica Roth, the third and final book in the Divergent trilogy. And if you read it, which I'm sure like all of you have by now, but if you've read it, you know that this book just, I can't even put it in words still. I read it in like December, somehow managed not to be spoiled that entire time, and now I just remember like closing it after I finished reading it. You should have seen I was just reading it, and I was just like, I just put it down and I lied in my bed for like 3 hours doing nothing because I was like, what just, that, oh, my feels, like it hurt so much. I was in complete shock that this had just happened. I was like, you can't do that, right? And oh my god. Like, I was really, really upset after this. Like, it took me like a good couple of weeks before I was actually able to pick up another book and read it. So the next one is not going to come as a surprise to anyone either, and that is Clockwork Princess by Cassandra Clare, the third and final book in the Infernal Devices trilogy. And oh my god, I'm sure we've all read this by now. The feels, man. Reading this book, like the entire thing, it just like breaks your heart because you're like, this is the last book. I've spent 2 books being emotionally invested in these characters. It's a love triangle that I loved so much, and then just sitting here like, okay, I'm gonna read this book. Here we go. Because you're just like, you know it's gonna end, and you don't want it to end because you're just so invested in these characters and their stories. And then what ends up happening, like I know like halfway through the middle part, you know, the part with Will and Jem, if you read it, you know the part I'm talking about, but I'm not gonna spoil it. But I just remember reading it and being like, oh, no, it's not true, I don't believe it, and closing the book and walking away for a couple days and not reading it. Then I came back to it, and I mean, by the time I got to the epilogue, like, as I've said, I don't cry in books, but this epilogue was the closest I've ever been to crying, just like the one scene. And I was like, oh my god, oh my god, oh my god, oh my god, oh my god. Because, I mean, these characters, because I loved these characters. All of, like, this was the hardest love triangle I've ever read about because I've been so torn between both Jem and Will, and just, it literally just, it was like, oh my god. And I didn't read a book for a little while after because I was just so emotionally unstable from reading it because I'd invested so much emotion into these characters. So the last book I have, I feel like no one has really read these books that much, at least not right now, recently, I don't know. I've never really heard anyone talk about them. My friend's like, yeah, she lent it to me, and she's like, read it, it's like sad, but it's really good, like you'll really like it, I'm sure. I was like, okay, whatever, sad, I can handle a sad book. This was in the summer of 2013, I was like, okay, I went into it completely blind. Sad does not cover this book. Emotionally traumatizing, okay? Like, I flew through this book because it was in the summer, okay? Flew through this book because whatever, I don't really do anything this summer. I was just reading, like, pretty much all summer. I guess I was numb, like, the entire time through reading it. When I closed it, I was like, what did I just read? I didn't even realize how much emotion I had literally invested in this book until I closed it. And I was like, I can't believe that just happened. And I literally couldn't read for like a month afterwards, okay? This is why this one is like my #1 book, because literally it was like a month. I could not pick up a book because I was still so emotionally unstable from it. And that book is Flowers in the Attic by V.C. Andrews. And still, to this day, I haven't picked up this book again to read Petals on the Wind, because it's a bind-up of Flowers in the Attic and Petals on the Wind. I read Flowers in the Attic. I still can't read Petals on the Wind because I can't emotionally prepare myself for that, because I just feel like after the first one, I've been like, I can't do it. I can't. Because it's so heartbreaking. Like, I can't, I'm not going to spoil it, but just everything that happens to these kids, I'm like, I can't even fathom that, like, that actually happening, because it just seems so ridiculously heartbreaking and heart-wrenching, and it just gets you so hard. I feel like V.C. Andrews just, like, went into my chest, pulled out my heart, ripped it up into a million pieces, hammered it down, ran over it with a transport truck, and then put it through a grinder for good measure. That's how it felt after reading this book. So that's my emotionally unstableness. I don't know what the next book is going to be that's going to leave me in this state, but God, I'm terrified for it, because actually I do know what book it might be. The City of Heavenly Fire, man. I've been waiting for that book for a really long time, and I know. Oh, I know when I read it, it's gonna break my heart. I'm gonna have to mentally prepare myself for that. But until next time, I will see you guys later with another video. Goodbye!